This is the dirt that built America.
(1946). Long Island, New York. And there's a worm doing something strange to the potato fields of Nassau County. A worm you cannot see because it lives underground in the roots. It's called the golden nematode. Microscopic. It burrows into a potato plant's roots and collapses it from the inside. And the frightening thing about it, if you're a farmer, is there's no warning above ground. No wilting leaves, no obvious sign. The potatoes just stop growing. One season you have a crop, the next, for no visible reason, you don't. Families who had worked this sandy, flat Nassau County soil since the colonial era, some of them going back to the 1600s, started selling. There wasn't much else to do. The ground was contaminated and nobody knew how to fix it or how long it would take. And in 1946, a 40-year-old developer named William Levitt noticed. He started buying. By the time he was done assembling parcels, and the number moves around in different accounts, somewhere between 1,000 and 7,000 acres, he owned an enormous stretch of blighted former potato farmland about 25 miles east of Manhattan. He paid agricultural prices for it, worm-filled dirt priced like worm-killed dirt. And he had a plan that had nothing whatsoever to do with potatoes. On May 7th, 1947, Levitt and Sons announced they'd build a neighborhood on that land. 2,000 houses, available to returning veterans, under $7,500, nothing down. Within 2 days of that announcement, more than half the units were rented. Within a few weeks, demand had blown so far past the original plan that Levitt expanded to 4,000 units. Then he kept going. By November of 1951, 4.5 years after that first announcement, a nematode blighted potato farm had become a town of 17,447 houses. More than 80,000 people. He named it after himself, the way men with that particular level of self-regard tend to do. Levittown. I want to spend this episode on how that happened and how fast, because I think it's the single clearest example in this whole series of the actual question I keep asking. How did we get here? Not here as in Long Island, here as in, why does almost every American live the way we live right now? The house, the yard, the 2-car garage, the drive to work. That template, the one you're picturing right now if you closed your eyes, got built on purpose in about 15 years, starting with this potato field. And it did not happen by accident. And it did not happen because Levitt was a genius working alone. Keep that second part in your back pocket because we're going to be coming back to it. To understand why this particular moment produced this particular explosion, you have to understand what the country actually looked like the day the war ended. 16 million Americans came home in 1945. Most of them were young men who'd spent their best years building airstrips in the Pacific or sleeping in mud in Europe, and what they wanted more than anything on earth was a house, a wife, a yard, and a life where nobody was shooting at them. They delayed everything: marriage, kids, furniture, the ordinary shape of adult life, and now they wanted all of it immediately. There was, for most of them, nowhere to live. The Depression had already crippled housing construction throughout the 1930s. The war finished the job. Materials went to the military, labor went to the military, and starting in 1942, the federal government explicitly banned most private construction to conserve resources. By 1947, an estimated 6 million American families were doubled up with relatives. 500,000 people were living in converted garages and huts. Structures that would have been called temporary in any other decade were now just where people lived. And here's the number that actually explains everything that's about to happen. The average American homebuilder in 1945 completed roughly 4 houses a year. 4 per builder for the entire industry. Now, into that gap steps a man who spent the war years as a CB in the Pacific watching the Navy build airstrips at a pace no civilian builder had ever attempted, and spending his off hours talking to every carpenter and electrician in his unit about how you'd replicate that speed for houses. William Levitt came home in 1945, 39 years old, with a head full of ideas nobody in residential construction had tried. And he went and tried them. Henry Ford's assembly line works because the product moves past stationary workers. The car rolls forward, the worker stays put. They do one job over and over and over. Now, you can't do that with a house. The house does not move. So, Levitt flipped it. He broke the construction of a single house into 27 discrete steps and trained 27 specialized crews, each one doing exactly one job and only that job. The crews moved. The house stayed still. Team 1 poured the slab, Team 2 framed it, Team 3 roofed it, then the whole chain shifted down the street to the next lot, one house behind like a wave. This is Levitt's own description of what he'd built. Quote, "The land was our factory floor," end quote. By 1947, his crews were finishing 18 houses a day. By July of 1948, 30 houses a day. Remember the number from a minute ago. The average American builder was doing 4 houses a year. Levitt's operation was clearing that in less than half a morning. And he didn't stop at labor. When lumber got scarce, he bought his own forest in California, and then he built his own mill. When cement wasn't available domestically, he chartered a ship and brought it in from Europe. When nails got tight, he put a nail factory behind the job site. He pre-built wall sections in a shop and trucked them to the lot for installation. His purchasing volume was so enormous, he was buying appliances straight from manufacturers at prices no small builder could touch. Does any of this sound familiar? The houses themselves were modest by design. 800 square feet, Cape Cod, 4.5 rooms, a kitchen with a built-in refrigerator and stove, a small yard. Every house on a street nearly identical to the next, which appalled the architecture critics of the era and delighted the veterans buying them. When you've spent 6 months sleeping in a tent in the Ardennes forest, identical to your neighbor's house is not a design flaw. It's fine. It's more than fine because no one's shooting at you. There's a detail about Levitt's father, Abraham, who ran landscaping and community design with the intensity of a man who had strong opinions about dahlias and no interest in hiding it. He told a reporter, and I want to give you this quote exactly as he said it, "Every man has a right to flowers," end quote. He meant it literally. He planted flowers along every street and a tree in front of every single house, spaced every 28 feet before a single family had moved in. And William Levitt himself, every Sunday, he'd drive his black Cadillac convertible slowly through the streets of the town he'd built, checking on lawn maintenance. Now, there's a detail that William Levitt himself almost never got asked about in interviews because reporters were too busy marveling at the houses. None of this works without a stranger's signature on a piece of paper in Washington. So the historian Kenneth Jackson, who wrote What's still considered the definitive account of how American suburbs actually got built, a book called Crabgrass Frontier, everyone should read it by the way, makes the case plainly. Levitt did not invent the conditions that made Levittown possible. He just moved faster than anyone else once those conditions existed. So here's what those conditions actually were. Before the 1930s, an American mortgage was genuinely frightening thing to sign. Banks typically demanded 40 to 50% down. Terms ran 5 to 7 years. And then the entire remaining balance came due, not paid down gradually, just due all at once in a lump sum. If you couldn't refinance, you lost the house. During the Depression, that's precisely what happened to millions of families. Banks called the loans, nobody could refinance in a frozen credit market, and the foreclosure rate went through a floor that a lot of people no longer owned. In 1934, the federal government responded by creating the Federal Housing Administration. Everybody here's heard of the FHA. The FHA didn't lend money directly. It insured mortgages that private banks made, which meant a bank could offer dramatically better terms while taking on much less risk. With FHA backing, banks suddenly were willing to write 30-year mortgages with as little as 10% down. Imagine that shift from 40 to 50% to suddenly it's 10% down. Then in 1944, the GI Bill pushed it even further, specifically for veterans. The Veterans Administration, or the VA, would guarantee loans with zero down at low interest for anyone who served. A researcher named Richard Rothstein spent years going through the actual underwriting manuals the FHA used during this era and laid out what he found in a book called The Color of Law. What he found isn't a footnote to this story, it's a mechanism. The FHA guidelines developed through the 1930s explicitly rated neighborhoods using a scoring system, and one of the factors in that score was racial composition. Mixed neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, older urban housing stocks. These got rated as poor credit risks, making them effectively ineligible for FHA-insured loans. New suburban development on farmland, especially ones with restrictive language keeping the neighborhood racially homogeneous, got the top ratings. Levittown's original lease stated in the actual contract language that homes could not, quote, be used or occupied by any person other than the members of the Caucasian race, end quote. To be clear, this was not an aberration specific to Levitt. It was standard practice across post-war suburban development, and it tracked directly with federal guidelines. Of the $120 billion in federal housing subsidy issued between 1934 and 1962, only about 2% reached non-white families. The mortgage machine that built the American middle class was, by design, a whites-only machine for most of the 20th century. Now, even cheap financing on its own wasn't quite enough. You could hand every veteran in America a zero-down mortgage, and they still wouldn't move to a potato field 25 miles from Manhattan if there was no way to get to work from there in under 3 hours. The highway was the other half of the deal. On June 29, 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, 41,000 miles of interstate highway authorized in a single bill. $26 billion, with the federal government covering 90% of the cost and the states covering the rest. At the time, it was the largest public works program in American history, bigger in dollar terms than the entire New Deal. Its official name was the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. I always chuckle when I read that because defense being in the name, purely political. That's how they sold it to Congress. Eisenhower had seen the German Autobahn during the war and understood exactly what a modern highway network did for moving troops. His administration also pointed to a series of civil defense drills in the early 1950s, operations called Wake Up, Scamper, Alert. that tried to simulate evacuating a major American city ahead of a Soviet nuclear strike. One general who watched the results called them, quote, appalling, end quote. Nothing moved fast enough. The roads simply couldn't handle it. The suburb in this framing wasn't just a housing solution. It was a defense strategy. Spread the population out of dense city centers, and a single bomb stops being able to take out everyone at once. Congress bought the argument. It also didn't hurt that the bill meant decades of construction contracts landing in every single congressional district in the country. The highways went in, and the suburbs spread outwards to meet them. 18 million Americans moved to suburbs during the 1950s alone. More people than came through Ellis Island in the entire peak decade of European immigration. Suburban share of the U.S. population went from about 23% in 1950 to 33% by 1960, and it just kept climbing from there. By 2010, more than half of all Americans lived in a suburb. The farmland at the edge of every major American city went through exactly what the Long Island potato fields went through. It stopped being valued for what you could grow on it and started being valued for something that hadn't really existed before. Proximity to a mortgage the government would insure and a road the government would build. David Halberstam, writing about this decade in his book, The 50s, described post-war America as a country congratulating itself on a boom that was quietly hollowing out its own core. And I think that tension is exactly what gets lost when the story gets told as a pure success. This wasn't a neutral expansion. It was a directional transfer of people, of wealth, of tax base, moving from American cities out to the fringe. The FHA's bias towards new urban suburban construction, combined with the migration of white middle-class families outward and the simultaneous denial that same migration to black families who couldn't get the same mortgages for the same houses, created conditions in American cities that took decades to fully show up in the numbers. As families left, the tax base shrank behind them. Retail followed the residents out. Manufacturing had already begun dispersing on its own. By the 1960s, cities that had been the popular economic engine of the country for 100 years were watching their populations decline and their budgets collapse at the same time. That's where the phrase urban decay enters the American vocabulary, and it describes something real, physical deterioration that was downstream of financial deterioration. And that was downstream of a specific, deliberate set of federal decisions about where money was and was not allowed to flow. Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, Baltimore, Newark. These city names became shorthand for exactly this. For what happens when you spend a decade redirecting a metro's area's entire economic energy towards its edges, while cutting the core off from the same financing making the edges possible. The families who took the no money down mortgages and moved to the streets with a tree every 28 feet weren't the villains here. Most of them were veterans who wanted a yard after years of war. But the system that made that yard available to them, and only to them, had consequences that outlasted the golden nematode by several decades. And you can still see those consequences in the geography of almost every major American city today. Let's circle back to William Levitt. Remember the Cadillac I told you to hold on to? Levitt's original purchase agreement for every Levittown home included a clause requiring the homeowner to mow the lawn at least once a week, April through November. And if you didn't, Levitt was authorized to mow it himself and bill you for it. He also invented the HOA. We really love this guy, don't we? And then, on top of the contract, he'd drive that black Cadillac convertible through the streets on Saturdays, personally checking. The man who built the American suburb from scratch spent his weekends making sure everyone was keeping it up properly. He also installed televisions in the houses before families ever moved in, unusual for the era and deliberate. His reasoning, and it was correct, a family with a television in the living room stays home in the evenings instead of out in the neighborhood getting into trouble. The house was supposed to be sufficient, complete within itself. Your house, your lawn, your TV, your car. What else could a person possibly need? The lease also barred putting up a fence without permission, barred hanging laundry outside on a Sunday, barred running a business out of your home. Every detail managed by a man who understood correctly that he wasn't just selling a shelter, he was selling a way of life, and the house was the only delivery mechanism for it. Some people found that stifling within about 5 minutes, but that's a whole different episode. The golden nematode worm, incidentally, is still in the soil of Nassau County today. Never actually eradicated, the county still runs a monitoring program for it. Potato farming really never came back to those fields. The environmental historian Adam Rome, who tallied up what farmland conversion like this actually costs the country in a book called The Bulldozer in the Countryside, makes the point that nobody was doing that math in 1947. Nobody was supposed to. The war had just ended, and a house with a yard looked like nothing but good news. The fields are all houses now, have been for about 75 years. So here's where I want to land this, because I told you at the start to keep one thing in your back pocket, that Levitt was very good at what he did, but he wasn't working alone. And I think that's the actual answer to how this country got the shape it has right now. The land didn't change because one developer had a brilliant insight about the future of Long Island. The land changed because the federal government decided, through 3 specific policy choices, FHA mortgage insurance in 1934, the VA loan guarantee in 1944, and the Interstate Highway Act in 1956, that it would. Levitt built faster and cheaper than anyone else alive at the time, but he was building inside a set of conditions. Conditions that Washington created, not conditions he invented himself. And whoever was positioned correctly when those policies landed captured the transformation. The Nassau County farmers who sold in time got a real price for blighted ground that would have been worth far less without the mortgages and the roads coming. The developer who bought that ground from them and turned it into a subdivision made considerably more. And the families who moved in after the subdivision was already built, well, they paid retail. That's not a rule specific to 1947 or to Long Island. It's the same dynamic that ran through the headright system, the Homestead Act, and the railroad towns that we talked about in previous series. Land is most valuable to whoever positions themselves before the infrastructure and the policy arrive, not after. William Levitt just ran that exact play at a scale nobody had ever attempted, with the potato blight as his opening and the United States government as his unwitting partner. All right, everyone, that's the story. If you liked it, there's more where that came from. New episodes drop pretty frequently. We're going to try to keep it on a weekly rhythm here. And the easiest way to catch them is to, of course, hit the subscribe button if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're listening on Spotify, follow on Spotify or whatever your favorite podcast channel is, if you'd rather have it running in the background on a drive. And if this kind of story makes you want to look at the ground under your own feet a little differently, if you're the type who wants to actually do something with that curiosity, not just enjoy it, which, again, perfectly fine with you just enjoying it, that's exactly what I built 10X Dirt for. It's where we get into the real current mechanics of land and development that's happening today. How deals get found, how they get entitled, how they actually get built. And what's scary about it is that it's pretty similar to a lot of the stuff that we talk about in this series. Either way, links in the description. Thanks for sticking around for this one. Look forward to catching you on the next one.